Every Sunday morning in a small church, a woman and her son stood side by side and sang together. The woman's name was Eliza Mae Wilson. Her son's name was Jackie. Nobody in that church choir knew that this small boy's voice would one day leave Elvis Presley speechless, make James Brown take mental notes, and shape the way Michael Jackson moved across a stage decades later. And nobody knew that the origin of that voice, its emotional depth, its four-octave range, its ability to hold a note and release it at exactly the right moment, came directly from the woman standing beside him. Eliza Mae Wilson was never a stage star, but she gave her son the most important gift he would ever receive. She taught him how to actually live inside music rather than simply perform it. Eliza Mae Wilson came from Columbus, Mississippi. When she moved to Detroit, she was one of thousands of black families who were part of the Great Migration, fleeing the discrimination of the segregated South in search of factory jobs and a different kind of life in the industrial North. Eliza Mae herself was a talented singer. She sang in her church choir, and the people who knew her described her voice as genuinely beautiful. This is not an incidental detail. Jackie Wilson's four-octave vocal range, a capability that very few singers achieve even with extensive professional training, had to come from somewhere. And that somewhere was, in large part, his mother. As a young boy, Jackie went to church with his mother. He listened to the choir, and more importantly, he sang alongside her. This simple ritual, a mother singing together with her son, was Jackie Wilson's first and most foundational connection to music. It wasn't formal vocal coaching. It wasn't a structured lesson plan. It was simply a mother passing down a musical inheritance to her son, in church, at home, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Jackie Wilson's father was frequently absent from the household. He struggled with alcoholism and rarely held steady employment. The family structure was fragile, and in the middle of that fragility, Eliza Mae Wilson became both mother and the family's genuine emotional anchor. Biographers who have researched Jackie Wilson's early life describe him as deeply attached to his mother, and describe Eliza Mae as a powerful and lasting influence throughout his life. This kind of household dynamic, a mother who serves as both emotional center and primary source of artistic foundation, while a father remains largely absent or unreliable, was common across many black families navigating the economic and social pressures of mid-century Detroit. But the specific musical inheritance that passed between Eliza Mae and her son was not common at all. Most children who grow up singing in church choirs do not go on to develop four-octave vocal ranges or become defining figures in the evolution of American popular music. What made the difference, beyond raw natural talent, was the depth and consistency of that early exposure. The fact that Jackie wasn't simply present in a room where music happened, he was actively participating in it, standing beside a woman whose own voice he could study, absorb, and eventually build upon.
Jackie's adolescence was not easy. He'd dropped out of school at 15. He was a troubled teenager, frequent truancy, minor legal trouble, periods spent in juvenile detention. During his time in the Lansing Corrections System, he learned to box, and the sport gave him something he badly needed at that point in his life: structure, discipline, and a way to build an identity of his own. By 16, he was competing in Detroit's amateur boxing circuit. His Golden Gloves record stood at 2-8, not an outstanding record, but evidence of genuine potential underneath the rough edges. This is the point where Eliza Mae Wilson stepped in. His mother asked him to give up boxing. The exact reasoning behind her request was never extensively documented, but it isn't difficult to imagine the natural concern a mother would feel about her son's physical safety in a sport built around taking and absorbing repeated blows. Boxing during this era was often seen as one of the few viable paths out of poverty for young black men, but it was also a path that wore down the body and offered no guaranteed future in return. Jackie listened to his mother. He gave up boxing. This decision carried far more weight than a simple disagreement between a mother and her teenage son. It was the turning point that permanently redirected the entire trajectory of Jackie Wilson's life. Had he continued boxing, he might have become a successful professional fighter, or he might not have. But the moment he stepped away from that path, music was already there waiting for him, ready to receive the energy and ambition that boxing had previously absorbed. The music his mother had taught him, the music he had sung in church, the music shared inside their home for years before that moment ever arrived. After giving up boxing, Jackie began devoting more of his time to music. He formed a gospel group called the Ever Ready Gospel Singers, performing in neighborhood churches around Detroit. These were the first real steps of his professional career, and the roots of those steps reached all the way back to the early years when his mother brought him to church and sang beside him. It is worth pausing on how unusual it was in that specific era and in that specific community for a mother's preference to carry enough weight to redirect a 16-year-old boy's path so completely. Teenage boys navigating Detroit's tougher neighborhoods in the early 1950s were not, as a general rule, easily persuaded by their mothers to abandon something they had begun to take seriously. Boxing offered Jackie status among his peers, a physical outlet for energy that might otherwise have gone toward less constructive pursuits, and a tangible measure of personal achievement that came from competing and occasionally winning. Walking away from all of that because his mother asked him to says something specific about the nature of their relationship, a trust and a closeness that ran deep enough to override the typical adolescent resistance to parental direction. That trust would prove to be one of the most consequential relationships in American music history, even though almost nobody outside Jackie Wilson's immediate circle understood its significance while it was actually happening.
At the core of Jackie Wilson's stage performance lies a fact that most people never fully recognize. The emotional depth of that performance came, in large part, from gospel music, and gospel reached him primarily through his mother. Gospel music is built on emotional honesty rather than pure technical perfection. A singer's voice is used not simply to hit the correct notes, but to communicate genuine belief, genuine sorrow, genuine joy. What Jackie Wilson did on stage, moving his voice from one emotional register to another, not merely singing a song but actually living inside it for the duration of the performance, was rooted directly in this gospel foundation. And those roots came straight from his mother. Eliza Mae Wilson herself never pursued a professional singing career. She sang in her church choir, raised her family, and watched her son grow up. But her voice, her relationship with music, passed on to him, and he carried that inheritance onto some of the largest stages in the world. At the peak of Jackie Wilson's career, while millions of people listened to his voice, very few of them knew that the origin of that voice traced back to a woman from Mississippi singing in a church choir. But the connection was real. Jackie Wilson's four-octave range, his emotional expressiveness, his ability to hold a note and then release it with devastating timing, all of it was rooted in the earliest music lessons a mother ever gave her son, lessons that were never formally called lessons at all. In 1975, Eliza Mae Wilson passed away, not long after making the journey from Detroit to New Jersey to visit her son in the hospital. She had traveled to see him while he lay in a coma, one of the final visits a mother could make to a child she had raised and shaped from the very beginning. She saw him one last time before she herself was gone. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the symmetry of that final visit. Decades earlier, Eliza Mae had stood beside her young son in a church pew, helping shape the voice that would eventually fill concert halls and stadiums. Now, near the end of both their lives, she made one last journey to stand beside him again,
this time in a hospital room rather than a church, with her son unable to respond, unable to sing back to her the way he had as a boy. The roles that music had once placed between them, teacher and student, mother and son learning together, had been replaced by something far more painful. A mother watching helplessly as the voice she had nurtured fell silent. She did not live to see what would eventually happen with that voice, the renewed chart success of Reet Petite 2 years after her son's death, the posthumous Hall of Fame induction, the generations of new listeners who would discover Jackie Wilson's recordings decades after both mother and son had passed. But she had already given everything she needed to give. The foundation had been laid years earlier in a small church, long before either of them could have imagined where that foundation would eventually lead.
When Jackie Wilson died in 1984, he was buried at West Lawn Cemetery in the mausoleum beside his mother. This might look like a simple, symbolic closing detail, but it actually reflects something much deeper. Jackie Wilson's story was never only his own story. His mother's voice, his mother's love, the decision she made to pull her son away from the boxing ring and toward music, all of it formed the foundation on which the legend of Jackie Wilson was eventually built. Eliza Mae Wilson's name does not appear in music history textbooks. She was not a stage star, not a songwriter, not a producer working behind the scenes of the industry. She was simply a mother, a woman who sang in church, who loved her son, and who one day told that son to put down the boxing gloves. But these simple acts, these ordinary expressions of love, are part of what allowed the world to eventually come to know Mr. Excitement. Everything Jackie Wilson did on stage, every knee drop, every note held just slightly longer than seemed possible, every emotional connection he built with an audience in real time, traced back in some essential way to the earliest musical inheritance a mother passed on to her son. This story is a reminder that behind great artists, there are often people whose contributions remain invisible to the public record, but are nonetheless real and foundational. Eliza Mae Wilson did not manage her son's career. She did not negotiate his contracts. She did not work behind the scenes of the music industry that would later exploit him. But she gave him the first and most essential thing that made Jackie Wilson who he eventually became, the ability to love sound, to actually live inside music rather than merely perform it, and to sing with a kind of emotional honesty that very few artists in any era have ever matched.
This kind of foundational, uncredited contribution is easy to overlook in narratives that focus primarily on discovery moments, breakout hits, and industry milestones. The story of Jackie Wilson is most often told beginning with his audition for the Dominoes in 1953 or with the release of Reet Petite in 1957, moments when the public record begins and the commercial machinery of the music industry takes over the narrative. But by the time those moments arrived, the most important work had already been done, years earlier, in a setting that no journalist or biographer was present to document. A mother and a son singing together on a Sunday morning in a church that no longer stands and that very few people outside Jackie Wilson's immediate family would ever be able to identify by name. That is where the real story begins. Not with a record contract, not with a stage name assigned by a band leader looking for something that would fit the image of his group. With a woman's voice and a boy standing close enough to hear it clearly, and to begin, without either of them realizing it at the time, building something that would eventually move millions of people who never knew her name. Jackie Wilson captivated millions on stage, but the origin of that captivating power existed somewhere no spotlight ever reached, in the voice of a woman from Mississippi singing in a small church choir, and in the love with which she passed that voice on to her only son. Mother and son now rest side by side in the same cemetery, and perhaps that is the truest possible ending to this story, because in the deepest sense, they were never really separated at all.
Every note Jackie Wilson ever sang was an echo of the gift his mother had given him long before the world ever knew his name. There is a particular kind of justice in that resting place, even if it arrived only after both of their lives had ended. The world remembers Jackie Wilson as Mr. Excitement, the man who made Elvis stop and stare, the architect of a performance language that shaped soul music and rock and roll for decades afterward. Far fewer people remember Eliza Mae Wilson at all, but the two of them are connected in a way that no amount of public recognition or its absence can undo. The voice that captivated the world began as her voice, shared in a small church, passed from mother to son with no expectation of fame or fortune attached to the gesture, simply a mother giving her child something she loved because she loved him. If Jackie Wilson's story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is dedicated entirely to Jackie Wilson, his triumphs, his losses, and everything that happened behind the curtain. Drop a comment below. Have you ever thought about the quiet influence standing behind a great artist? We'll see you in the next story.